The first sound I heard that morning was not the bell, nor the murmur of voices from the courtyard, but the low, steady breathing of the river itself. Even before I opened my eyes, I could feel it, the gentle weight of its presence pressing softly into the clay walls of our small cell, filling the cool air with a faint scent of water, silt, and distant vegetation. The Ganges did not sleep, not even in the hours before dawn. It moved always, calmly and without hurry, like a thought the earth had been repeating to itself for a very long time. I lay for a moment on my simple woven mat, my body still heavy with the last traces of sleep. The stone floor beneath the mat held the night's coolness. Above me, the faint outline of the ceiling beams was just visible in the dim light. Somewhere beyond the thin wall, someone shifted, then became still again. The whole monastery felt wrapped in a quiet breathing, a shared rhythm that seemed to move through every room. Then the bell sounded, a single, clear note that rose through the stillness and hung for a moment in the air. It was not harsh or urgent. It did not demand that we wake. It simply reminded us that the morning was already approaching, that the sky outside the courtyard would soon begin to pale. I exhaled slowly, feeling the last clinging threads of sleep loosen, and then I sat up. The air inside the cell was cool against my skin. I drew my simple cotton robe around my shoulders and let my bare feet rest on the mat for a moment before placing them on the stone. The slight shock of the floor's coolness helped my mind clear. In the faint light that seeped in around the edges of the door, I could see the few simple things that belonged to me: a folded cloth, a clay water cup, a small bundle of writing reeds tied with a piece of twine. I stood and moved quietly to the door, sliding it open just enough to step into the corridor. The passageway outside was lit only by the dim glow of a small oil lamp placed in a niche along the wall. Its flame burned steadily, sending a thin thread of smoke upward that barely disturbed the stillness. Shadows gathered in the corners, soft and unthreatening. A few other novices were already moving along the corridor, their steps as quiet as my own. We nodded to one another without speaking. There was no rush. The bell had sounded once, we knew there would be a second chime soon. We moved toward the courtyard with the calm, unhurried rhythm that the elders always encouraged in us, as though even our footsteps were a part of the practice. The courtyard opened like a cool stone bowl under the slowly brightening sky. The air outside was fresher, washed with the faint scent of damp earth and river mist. The walls around the open space were low on one side, allowing a glimpse of the trees that grew near the water's edge, mango and peepal, their leaves dark and still in the pre-dawn light. Above them, the sky was a deep, gentle blue, beginning to pale near the horizon. In the center of the courtyard, the main bell hung from a simple wooden frame. It was made of bronze, its surface worn smooth by years of ringing and touch. An older monk stood near it, his robe falling in straight, quiet lines around his feet. As we gathered, he raised the wooden striker once more and let it swing. The bell's second note rang out, deeper this time, reverberating through the courtyard and into the surrounding rooms. We took our places along the inner edge, settling onto the low stone ledge that ran around the walls. No one spoke. The only sounds were the fading echo of the bell, the distant call of a bird waking in the trees, and the soft shuffle of fabric as we adjusted our robes around us. Beyond the courtyard walls, the river's constant murmur continued, so quiet that we were aware of it more as a feeling than as a sound. The abbot stepped into the courtyard from the far side, his movements unhurried, his posture as straight and calm as the trees near the river. His robe was no different from the others we wore, but something about the way it hung from his frame made it seem more rooted, more settled. His face was lined, not with sharp creases but with the soft, deep marks of many years spent in this same place, under this same sky. He sat on a simple woven mat near the bell and closed his eyes. We followed his example, bowing our heads slightly, letting our attention turn inward but also outward at the same time, to the breath, to the stillness, to the river and the sky. In that quiet, I counted my breaths gently, not as a strict exercise, but as a way of letting thoughts loosen and drift away, like leaves leaving a branch on a calm day. The sky above the courtyard continued to change. Behind my closed eyes, I imagined its gradual brightening, the soft spreading of light from one edge, the faint paling of stars. A breeze moved lightly through the open space, carrying with it the coolness of water and the distant smell of smoke from small cooking fires in the village beyond the monastery walls. We sat together in that shared stillness for as long as the abbot chose. Time in those moments did not feel like something measured. It felt instead like a deep, slow pool, and we were simply sitting at its edge. When at last I heard the gentle sound of the abbot's robe as he shifted slightly, I opened my eyes. The world had changed while we sat. The courtyard was now filled with a softer, clearer light. The eastern sky above the trees had turned a pale, luminous gold. The tops of the leaves glowed faintly where they caught the emerging sun. The shadows along the walls had shortened and softened. The abbot looked at us, his gaze passing gently over each face without lingering. "We rise with the river," he said quietly, his voice carrying easily, though he did not speak loudly. "Not against it." Then he stood and left the courtyard as simply as he had entered. No one rushed to follow him. Instead, we rose in small groups, some heading toward the well, others toward the storerooms or kitchen area. The day's tasks were simple and familiar, repeated with small variations but always in the same calm, unhurried pattern. My duty that morning was to help in the library. Before going there, I walked to the low wall at the edge of the grounds where one could see the river more clearly. The Ganges flowed wide and steady, its surface catching the light of the new sun in 1,000 small reflections. The current moved with an unforced strength, carrying bits of leaves, small twigs, and the occasional flower offering left upstream. Along the far bank, fields stretched into the distance, already beginning to glow with the early sunlight. A few small figures moved among them, farmers starting their work, oxen guided slowly along the paths. Closer to us, near the monastery's landing steps, 2 boys from the village crouched at the water's edge, filling clay pots. A small wooden boat was tied to a post nearby, its rope wet and dark where the river had soaked it. The boat rocked gently, as though listening. I stood there for a few moments, letting the sight and sound of the water sink into me. The river always seemed to move through my chest as much as before my eyes, its steady flow reminding me to soften my own thoughts. The elders often spoke of it as a teacher that never used words. When I turned away and made my way toward the library building, the sun had risen a little higher, its light now touching the tops of the monastery's tiled roofs. The library was a long, low structure built of stone and wood, its inner rooms cool and dim even on the brightest days. Inside, shelves carved from dark wood lined the walls, holding neat stacks of palm leaf manuscripts bound with cotton thread. The air smelled of dried leaves, ink, and the faint trace of cedar oil used to keep insects away. An older monk named Ananta waited for me near a low table, his thin hands resting on a bundle of palm leaves. His head was shaved like ours, but a fine fringe of white hair had begun to grow just above his ears. He gave me a small nod. "Today," he said, "we will clean and oil some of the older texts. The rains last year brought more moisture than usual. The leaves must be checked. I bowed slightly in acknowledgement and sat beside him. He placed a shallow wooden bowl between us, filled with a mixture of oil and fine powder. The oil smelled faintly of flowers and something resinous, a comforting scent that I associated with long quiet hours among these shelves. Carefully, we unfolded the first manuscript, lifting the thread that tied the bundle together and laying the leaves out one by one on a clean cloth. The writing on them was dark and steady, small groups of symbols arranged in lines that ran neatly from one end to the other. I could not read all of them yet, some were written in an older style, some in a script rarely used, but I recognized enough to know that these were treatises on plants and their qualities, compiled by those who had studied the ways of roots, leaves, and seeds long before my time. Ananta dipped a soft cloth into the oil mixture and dabbed it lightly along the edges of the leaf. "Not too much," he said gently. "They are old, but not fragile. They only need to remember how to bend without breaking." I followed his example, my movements slow and precise. As we worked, the light from the small high windows shifted gradually, moving in narrow bands across the floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams, drifting like tiny, uncertain stars. The morning passed in this way, quiet, steady, measured in the gentle rhythm of our careful work. Occasionally, from outside, I would hear the faint sound of sandals on stone, or the distant laughter of children from the village, or the lowing of cattle somewhere near the riverbank. Each sound arrived softly and then faded again, like ripples on water. At midday, a novice came to the library to call us for the meal. We set aside the leaves we had finished, tied the bundle loosely, and covered it with a cloth. Then we washed our hands in a brass basin near the door and walked to the dining hall. The hall was a simple long room with low benches along either side and a row of clay bowls set out on a central platform. We ate in silence, as we usually did, sitting side by side. The meal was plain but satisfying, rice cooked soft, a thin lentil stew, a small portion of boiled vegetables, and a piece of flat bread. The warmth of the food settled into my body in a gentle way, easing the stiffness in my shoulders from bending over the manuscripts. After the meal, we carried our bowls to the washing area, cleaned them, and set them on a rack to dry. The sun was high now, and the courtyard had grown warmer. A few monks sat in the shade of a neem tree, their eyes half closed, resting before the afternoon tasks. The sound of the river had changed slightly, the wind had risen, and small ripples now crossed its surface, catching the light in broken, shimmering patterns. The afternoon was given over to simple work. Some of the older monks instructed novices in basic chants and recitations. Others tended the vegetable garden at the edge of the grounds, trimming wilted leaves, guiding water from a small channel into the beds. A pair of brothers repaired a section of the path that had cracked in the last rains, tapping stones back into place with flat wooden tools. I was sent to help near the river, where a small grove of bamboo needed to be cleared of fallen leaves. The air there felt cooler, the ground shaded. The leaves underfoot were dry and soft, their pale surfaces rustling quietly as we moved through them. The trunks of the bamboo swayed slightly in the breeze, producing a subtle creaking sound that blended with the murmur of the water. As I gathered leaves into small bundles, I paused now and then to glance toward the river. The afternoon light had made it paler, almost white where it reflected the sky. A group of women from the village stood together at the edge, washing cloths and talking in low voices. A small boy splashed his feet in the shallows, watched by an older sister. A heron stood farther out on a submerged rock, perfectly still, waiting for the right moment to lower its beak. The work did not require much thought, and I let my mind move slowly, like the river's current. I thought of the star we had measured the night before, of the careful lines of writing on the palm leaves, of the way the abbot's voice had sounded in the courtyard at dawn. Each image seemed to settle into place inside me, forming no story, no conclusion, just a quiet sequence of moments connected by the same thin thread of breath. By the time the sun began to lower, casting longer shadows across the grounds, our tasks ended for the day. We returned to the courtyard, washed our hands and faces in the cool water from the well, and prepared for the evening recitation. The sky above the walls had begun to change again, this time from the bright pale blue of afternoon into the softer tones of evening. Streaks of faint orange and pink brushed the horizon. The air cooled slightly, bringing with it the scent of cooking fires from the village beyond, spices, smoke, and the earthy aroma of grains. We gathered once more along the courtyard's inner edge as the abbot entered. A small oil lamp had been lit near the bell. Its flame wavered gently in the breeze. The abbot sat, and we followed, our robes settling around us like quiet waves. He began a simple chant, his voice low and steady. We joined in, not loudly, but with enough strength that the sound filled the courtyard. It did not rise high or echo sharply. It seemed instead to sink gently into the stone, into the air, into the listening leaves of the trees just beyond the wall. Words blended into tones, tones blended into something almost like the river's own murmur. When the chant ended, the sky had deepened another shade. A single star had appeared overhead, faint but clear. The abbot spoke a few soft words about the day, about the importance of simple work done with attention, of breathing with the river, of letting the mind grow spacious like the sky at dusk. His voice was calm, with no sharp edges, and the words settled inside me like small, smooth stones placed carefully in a bowl. The lamp was extinguished, leaving the courtyard lit only by the fading light of the sky. We rose and moved back toward our rooms, our steps slower now, our bodies ready for rest. In my cell, I lay again on my mat, the stone floor now holding some of the day's warmth. Through the small opening near the ceiling, I could see a narrow slice of sky. A few more stars had appeared, scattered in quiet brightness. The sound of the river reached me, softer now, a low, continuous presence just at the edge of hearing. I let my eyes close, my breath fall into the same slow rhythm as the water's flow. The day's images faded one by one, the bell, the manuscripts, the bamboo leaves, the heron, until they became no more than gentle impressions, like marks left in sand after a breeze. Sleep came as gradually and quietly as dawn had, sliding over me like deepening shade, until there was nothing left but the softness of night and the steady movement of the river in the distance. The second morning of that quiet week began in almost the same way as the first, and yet I felt a subtle difference in the air, as if the river had shifted its tone by a single note. When I woke, there was the same coolness in the stone beneath my mat, the same faint scent of oil and dust in the small cell, the same softness in the gray light that seeped in through the narrow opening near the ceiling. But beneath all that, I sensed a slight heaviness in the air, not unpleasant, more like the weight of a blanket drawn gently across the earth. I lay still for a few breaths, listening. The river's low murmur reached me as it always did, like a far-off chant that had no beginning and no end. Somewhere in the distance beyond the walls, a bird called once, then fell silent. No bell had sounded yet. In that moment between sleep and waking, the world felt suspended, as if everything waited for something that had not yet arrived. Then, like a reminder rather than an interruption, the bell rang, one clear, steady note that slipped through the corridor, through the courtyard, through the cracks in doors and shutters, and into the quiet spaces of our minds. I exhaled slowly, rolled onto my side, and sat up. My body felt rested, my limbs comfortably heavy. I wrapped my robe around my shoulders, feeling the familiar roughness of the fabric. The simple knot of the belt found its place almost without my thinking about it. When I opened the door and stepped into the corridor, the lamp in its wall niche still burned with a small flame. Shadows lay thick along the edges of the passageway, but they held no mystery. They were the same shadows I had walked through every day since coming here, shaped by the same stones, shifting only with the light. A few other novices walked ahead of me toward the courtyard. We moved in silence, our bare feet making only the softest whispers on the worn floor. The second bell sounded as we entered the open space, its richer tone spreading outward like a slow breath. The courtyard was touched now by the first pale hints of morning. The sky above the low wall was lighter than the deeper blue of the night beyond. The leaves of the neem and peepal trees stood still, dark against that softening backdrop. I took my place along the inner edge, folding my legs beneath me, resting my hands lightly on my knees. When the abbot entered, I felt again that almost imperceptible shift that happened whenever he stepped into a room, as if the air decided to settle a little more firmly into its proper place. He walked to his mat near the bell and sat, closing his eyes with a slow, unhurried movement that seemed to take the entire courtyard with it into stillness. We followed, lowering our chins, letting our eyes close, letting our breathing lengthen. This morning, instead of counting my breaths, I simply listened. I listened to the way the bell's last echo faded into silence, leaving behind a subtle hum in the stone. I listened to the way the river's murmur blended with the faint rustle of a robe somewhere to my left. I listened to the quiet space between sounds, the gentle expanse that seemed to open up inside my chest when I stopped trying to fill it with anything. After some time, I began to notice the change in the sky through my closed eyelids, light pressing softly against them from above, warming the thin skin. When the abbot finally shifted and opened his eyes, I did the same. The courtyard was brighter now, though the sun had not yet risen high enough to reach inside. The walls glowed faintly, and a narrow strip of light lay along the ground near the eastern edge. The abbot's gaze moved slowly from one of us to another, not to judge or measure, but to acknowledge. "Today," he said quietly, "let the mind walk as gently as the body. No need to hurry in either." He rose, and we bowed, then gradually dispersed. Some walked toward the kitchen, others toward the storerooms, others toward the gardens that fringed the monastery walls. My assigned duty that day was to assist at the river steps, where water was drawn for cooking, washing, and offering. I walked along the narrow path leading from the courtyard to the ghat. The path sloped downward gently, shaded by trees whose roots gripped the earth in long, twisting lines. The sound of the river grew clearer as I approached, the steady push and pull of the water against the steps, the occasional splash of something falling in, the distant call of a boatman's voice. When I emerged from the shade of the trees, the river lay before me, wide and softly colored in the early light. The sky above it was a pale, almost pearly blue, and the sun had just begun to appear above the horizon, casting a gentle silver glow on the water's surface. Thin strands of mist clung to the opposite bank, rising from the reeds and low grasses. The stone steps of the ghat descended into the water in smooth, worn lines. Their edges were darkened by years of contact with the river. A few monks were already there, filling clay pots slowly and setting them aside in neat rows. Their movements were measured, careful, as if the water they carried deserved the same attention as any sacred text. I joined them, picking up an empty pot and lowering it carefully into the river. The water felt cooler than the air, smooth against my fingers. As the pot filled, it grew heavier in my hands, and I lifted it with deliberate effort, letting the excess water drain in a thin stream before setting it gently beside the others. A novice named Arun worked next to me. We often shared tasks like this, and though we rarely spoke during them, his presence was familiar and calming. His face was still soft with youth, and his movements held a quiet earnestness. After a while, when the first row of pots had been filled, he glanced at the river and then at me. "The current seems stronger today," he said in a low voice, careful not to disturb the quiet. I watched the water for a few moments. He was right. The surface looked a little livelier, the small patterns of ripples more pronounced. "Perhaps the snowmelt is reaching us," I replied. "Or the rains upstream." He nodded and returned to his work. The conversation ended as naturally as it had begun, slipping back into the silence between the sounds of the water and our movements. When enough pots had been filled, 2 older monks began carrying them up the path in pairs, balancing the weight with practiced ease. Arun and I stayed a little longer at the river's edge, gathering stray leaves from the steps and brushing them aside so they would not clog the narrow cracks between the stones. At one point, I paused and simply watched the water slide past, thick and calm at the center, more playful along the edges. A small flower drifted by, some offering released upstream, its petals still bright, turning slowly in the current. The abbot sometimes said that the river accepted everything but clung to nothing. Watching the flower spin gently before being carried onward, I thought I understood a little of what he meant. By the time we finished, the sun had risen higher, and a warm golden light lay across the river. The mist on the opposite bank had lifted. The fields there were clear now, rows of crops faintly visible. A pair of white birds wheeled overhead, then glided down to rest near the shore. Back at the monastery, the smell of rice cooking drifted through the corridors. The courtyard buzzed with a quiet energy as monks completed small tasks before the midday meal. I washed my hands and face at the well, letting the cool water rinse away the faint layer of river silt on my skin, then joined the others in the dining hall. The meal was as simple as the day before: rice, lentils, vegetables, but the heat and taste of it felt new, as if each grain had its own small story of growing, being harvested, being carried here. We ate in silence, the soft clink of spoons and bowls forming a kind of unintentional rhythm. Afterward, when the bowls had been washed and set aside, the heat of the day grew stronger. The courtyard brightened, but the library and inner rooms remained cool and shaded. I was given a few hours of rest before the afternoon's tasks, and I returned to my cell. I lay down on my mat, not to sleep but to let the body soften. From my small window slit, a narrow stripe of light stretched across the wall and floor, slowly moving as the sun traveled across the sky. Dust motes drifted lazily through it, spinning in silent arcs. My thoughts wandered, not in the restless way they sometimes had before I came to the monastery, but like someone walking through familiar fields with no particular destination. I thought of the river and the flower turning in its current, of the manuscripts in the library, of the way the abbot's voice always seemed to sound like something the river would approve of. After some time, I sat up again, feeling rested in a way that was deeper than sleep. The bell in the courtyard rang once to signal the change of duties. That afternoon, I was asked to help in the garden near the western wall, where medicinal plants and simple vegetables grew in neat, carefully tended rows. The garden was surrounded by a low fence of woven branches. Inside, the earth was dark and soft, shaded in places by small trees. Narrow channels carried water from a nearby well, their surfaces reflecting small patches of sky. I joined 2 other novices and an older monk named Dev, who oversaw the garden's care. Today, our work was to loosen the soil around the roots, remove any dry or yellowed leaves, and guide the flow of water toward the beds that needed it most. The tools we used were simple, wooden-handled trowels, flat stones, our own hands. This one, Dev said, pointing to a patch of tall, slender plants with narrow leaves, helps cool the body. Its leaves are boiled in water during heat and fever. He spoke not as if giving a lecture, but as if describing the habits of an old friend. And that, he added, gesturing to a lower, broader plant with rounded leaves, soothes the stomach when it grips too tightly. We moved slowly between the rows, our robes brushing gently against one another. I knelt beside a bed of small purple-flowered plants and pressed my fingers into the soil. It was moist but not wet, just as Dev had taught us was best. I loosened it gently, feeling it crumble and fall away in small clumps. Occasionally, a breeze would move through the garden, carrying with it the mixed scents of soil, leaves, and distant water. The combination was grounding, like breathing in pieces of both earth and sky at once. As the afternoon went on, the light grew softer, less harsh. Long shadows stretched from the trees and walls. The air lost some of its heat and gained instead a sweetness that comes only when the day begins to release its hold. We finished our tasks, rinsed our hands in a basin at the garden's edge, and walked back toward the courtyard. Evening was approaching. The sky above had begun to shift again, turning from bright blue to softer hues. I could already see where the first thin streaks of orange were gathering near the horizon. The evening recitation followed, just as it had the night before. We gathered in the courtyard, sat in our places, listened to the abbot's steady chant, and joined in. My voice felt more settled tonight, my breath flowing more easily beneath the words. The sound of our recitation seemed to blend completely with the river's murmur, until it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Later, after the chant had faded and the abbot's closing words had settled inside us like small, luminous stones, we were left to our own quiet before sleep. Some monks walked slowly along the inner paths, hands clasped behind their backs, eyes lowered. Others sat against the walls, looking up at the sky. The first stars had appeared, though the sky still held traces of gold and rose. I walked once more toward the western edge of the grounds, where a low wall overlooked the fields beyond. The land lay in long, shadowed shapes under the deepening sky. Fireflies had begun their silent dance near the grasses, small points of light appearing and disappearing with no pattern I could discern. From there, I could hear the river again, clearly but softly. It seemed a little louder at night, or perhaps the world simply grew quiet enough for its voice to be heard more fully. I rested my forearms on the top of the wall and watched the sky darken. Tonight, clouds streaked parts of the heavens, thin, long wisps that flowed across the stars, veiling them without hiding them completely. The light of the moon, still low, brushed those clouds from below, giving them a soft, glowing edge. For a long time, I simply stood there, allowing the night to arrange itself around me. No thoughts pressed urgently for attention. They rose and fell like small waves, that leaf in the river, that flower, that bell, that star, and then subsided into the larger quiet. When I finally returned to my cell and lay down, the sound of the river followed me inward as it always did. It had been a day like many others, with nothing grand or extraordinary to mark it. And yet, lying there in the gentle darkness, I felt that the day had filled me the way the river had filled the clay pots at dawn, slowly, steadily, without any need for haste. My breathing matched the river's pace. My eyes grew heavy. The last thing I was aware of before sleep came was the faint, comforting sense that somewhere beyond the walls, under the same night sky, the Ganges continued its patient, unending journey. And I, for a little while, was allowed to rest beside it, carried not by its current, but by its calm. The third day began with a softness so complete that, for a moment, I could not tell whether I was awake or still drifting in the space just before waking. The air in my cell felt warmer than the day before, and the faint light creeping along the wall had a muted, diffuse quality, as though it had passed through a thin veil of mist before reaching me. The sound of the river was gentler too, muffled slightly, but steady. Everything seemed wrapped in a delicate hush, as if the world had placed a protective hand around the edges of the morning. I sat up slowly, allowing the moment to stretch, and drew in a long breath. The scent of damp earth reached me through the small opening above the door, moisture rising from the riverbanks as the first touch of early light warmed them. I wrapped my robe around my shoulders and stepped quietly into the corridor. A single lamp still flickered in its wall niche, and its flame cast wide, wavering shadows that drifted like slow-moving water along the stone. The bell had not yet sounded. A few novices were already awake, moving silently toward the courtyard. Their faces were calm, softened by the quiet of the hour. The air spoke of mist lying low near the ground. I could feel its coolness on my skin even before we reached the open space. When the first bell finally rang, its sound was softer than usual, muted by the damp air. It spread through the courtyard like a slow ripple, then softened into silence. We settled into our places along the inner wall as the light brightened, first a pale silver, then a warm, faint gold. The abbot entered moments later, his robe carrying beads of moisture from the air outside. He sat as he always did, but today he lingered a little before closing his eyes, turning his face slightly toward the eastern sky as though listening for something within it. Only after a long breath did he guide us into quietness. I closed my eyes. My breath fell into its natural rhythm, long, deep inhalations, slow, unhurried exhalations. The river's sound reached me in a softened form, like a memory of itself. I let my mind rest in that rhythm until the warmth of the rising sun began to press faintly through my eyelids. When the abbot ended the meditation, the courtyard had transformed. The mist had begun to lift, drifting upward in delicate strands that caught the new sunlight. The trees near the river glistened with droplets. A few birds fluttered from branch to branch, shaking off the night's moisture. Everything felt newly washed. Today, my task was to join Dev in the garden again, but before that, the abbot had asked me to fetch water from the ghat. I walked down the familiar sloping path, the air growing cooler as I neared the river. The mist lay thicker there, floating just above the surface of the water like a soft white blanket. The sun had not yet risen high enough to burn it away. 2 monks stood at the steps already, their silhouettes softened by the haze. I approached quietly, picked up an empty pot, and lowered it into the river. The surface parted smoothly. When I lifted the pot again, droplets ran down its sides in small, shimmering trails. Something about the water felt different today, denser, perhaps, or simply carrying the weight of the mist along with its usual flow. I watched the surface for a while. The river seemed slower, though I knew its current never truly changed so quickly. Perhaps it was only the way the mist drifted that altered its appearance. Arun arrived shortly after, his face half hidden by the soft dampness in the air. He carried 2 pots, one in each hand, and set them down with a quiet thud. "It feels like the river is still half asleep," he said, barely above a whisper. I nodded. "The mist makes everything slower." He looked out over the water for a moment, then smiled faintly. "It suits the morning." We finished our task without rushing. When we carried the pots back up the path, the sun finally broke through the mist in sharp, golden beams. They angled through the trees, catching tiny droplets that sparkled like grains of ground glass suspended in air. Back at the monastery, I delivered the water to the kitchen, washed my hands, and made my way to the garden. Dev was already there, kneeling beside a row of plants, his robe gathered neatly around him. He looked up as I approached, then returned his gaze to the soil. "The earth is thirsty today," he said. "It has taken the moisture of the mist but left its roots dry." I knelt beside him, running my fingers over the ground. He was right. The surface felt cool but not damp. We began loosening the soil gently with our small wooden tools. The earth's smell rose around us, deep, rich, grounding. In the shade of the trees, we worked slowly, letting each motion fall into the next. At one point, Dev paused and shifted a small stone to the side. Beneath it, a curled millipede emerged, its many legs moving in a tight ripple before it disappeared beneath a nearby leaf. "Everything has its place here," Dev murmured, though he spoke more to himself than to me. We continued working until the sun warmed the garden walls. Then a novice came to call us for the midday meal. As always, it was simple and warm: rice, lentils, vegetables. The taste was familiar but comforting, and the warmth filled the calm spaces inside me rather than waking anything restless. After the meal, while others rested or prepared for afternoon lessons, I was sent to help in the small room adjacent to the library. This room held the monastery's ink supplies: clay pots filled with thick black ink, trays of soot, dried twigs for stirring, pouches of crushed leaves for various pigments. The room always smelled faintly of smoke and aged parchment. My task was to mix a fresh batch of ink. Ananta supervised from a few paces away, his eyes following each of my movements. I had done this before, but not often. The mixture had to be precise: soot ground into the finest powder, water warmed just enough to disperse it, gum sap added in small drops to bind the mixture, and a crushed leaf infusion to preserve it. As I stirred the mixture in a wide clay bowl, the consistency gradually changed from thin gray to a deep, glossy black. The transformation happened slowly, the color darkening with each turn of the wooden spoon. "You must feel the thickness, not just see it," Ananta reminded me gently. I lifted the spoon, watched the ink fall in smooth ribbons, then nodded. "It's nearly ready." He stepped closer, dipped a thin reed into the ink, and wrote a short symbol onto a palm leaf. The mark dried with a rich, even sheen. "It will serve," he said, covering the bowl with a cloth. We spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the ink stones and organizing writing tools. The small repetitive motions were almost like a meditation: pick up a reed, inspect it, trim the end, place it beside the others, rinse a stone, dry it, stack it neatly. The world shrank to simple shapes and motions, and time seemed to slow. As the afternoon drew to a close, the sky turned warmer in color, the light slanting through the doorway in thin golden lines. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of the courtyard, soft laughter, quiet conversation, the rhythmic chop of vegetables, floated in like gentle waves. Before evening recitation, I walked once more to the riverbank. The mist had long since lifted, and the water was now a clear, deep blue, reflecting the late afternoon sky. A pair of fishermen in a small wooden boat moved slowly across the surface, their oars dipping and rising with soft splashes. A cow stood near the water's edge, its reflection wavering in the gentle ripples. I sat on one of the lower steps of the ghat, barely letting my feet touch the cool stone. The river's sound here was fuller, closer. Its rhythm seemed to seep into me, matching the pace of my breath. I could have stayed there for hours, but the evening bell sounded faintly from above, calling me back. In the courtyard, the lamps had been lit. Their flames flickered softly, casting warm pools of light across the stone. The abbot entered, and together we began the chant. Tonight, the sound felt especially deep in my chest, as though the day's quiet had shaped my voice into something softer. The recitation ended just as the first stars appeared overhead. The abbot offered a few closing reflections, simple words about patience, about the breath, about the river's teaching that all things change without haste. His voice settled into the stillness like a stone into calm water. Afterward, I lingered in the courtyard for a while as others drifted away. The sky above had turned a deep, velvety blue. A few clouds stretched thin across it, glowing faintly where they passed in front of the rising moon. I walked once more toward the western wall where I had stood the night before. The fields beyond were quiet, their outlines soft in the moonlight. Fireflies traced slow patterns near the grass, their lights blinking on and off like tiny breath cycles. The river's sound reached me clearly now. It was no longer muffled by morning mist or softened by afternoon warmth. Now it spoke with its full night voice, deep, steady, almost melodic. I leaned against the wall and let that sound fill me. I thought of nothing in particular, yet everything seemed connected: the garden soil, the ink in the clay bowl, the mist that had clung to the river, the slow light of dawn, the millipede beneath the stone, the chant in the courtyard. All simple things, yet each one part of a much wider stillness. When I finally returned to my cell and lay down, the stone floor had cooled again. I pulled my robe around me and closed my eyes. The river's gentle rhythm followed me into the quiet space inside my mind. Sleep came slowly, like a long exhale, drawing the day's moments into darkness one by one until only a deep, soft silence remained. The fourth morning arrived with a brightness that seemed softer than sunlight, as though the day had decided to reveal itself gradually, in layers so thin that they were almost indistinguishable. Before I opened my eyes, I could feel the warmth of it brushing the wall near my mat. The faint scent of dried herbs, maybe from the kitchen storeroom, maybe from the garden, floated in the still air. The river's voice reached me from a distance, steady and familiar, the one sound that anchored every morning here. I lay for a moment, listening to the world around me. A quiet shifting of cloth in the corridor. The distant clatter of a pot being set down in the kitchen. A bird, one with a clear, bright call, singing somewhere near the upper branches of the peepal tree. The small sounds moved gently through the early hour, each one passing through the quiet without disturbing it. Then, as if to affirm that morning had truly arrived, the bell rang. Its deep, single note filled the corridor outside my cell, rolled across the courtyard, and then seemed to dissolve slowly into the stillness. I rose, folded my blanket neatly at the foot of the mat, and tied my robe around my waist. My movements felt slower than usual, but not from tiredness. Rather, the entire morning seemed to encourage slowness, to support it, even. In the corridor, the lamps were dimming as the natural light grew. A novice walked ahead of me with a gentle step, carrying a small cloth bundle. When he turned slightly, the morning light touched his cheek in a soft glow. He smiled at me, just a small, quiet gesture, and continued on toward the courtyard. Outside, the air was cool and touched with moisture. A tiny cluster of dewdrops clung to the edges of the stone walkway, glowing faintly. Mist drifted near the tops of the garden trees. The courtyard felt like a bowl of still water, wrapped in the delicate sheen of early light. We took our places along the inner wall. The abbot arrived shortly after, his steps unhurried, his expression peaceful. He sat, folded his hands loosely in his lap, and closed his eyes. We followed. For a long time, nothing moved except the slow shifting of light across the courtyard floor. I let my breath flow gently, smooth, unforced. Thoughts appeared and disappeared like fish moving beneath a calm surface. The river, too, seemed quieter today, as though listening. At last, the abbot inhaled deeply and opened his eyes. The meditation ended, not with a bell or a gesture, but simply with that one breath. We raised our heads slowly. Today, he said softly, the river will show us something about brightness. Notice it without reaching for it. He did not explain further. He rarely did. His words were always just enough to plant a seed, never enough to force understanding. After morning practice, I was assigned once more to the ghat, but this time not to carry water. Instead, I was to help repair a small section of the stone steps that had cracked during the last monsoon. I took up a basket of small tools and walked down the path toward the river. The morning mist had begun to lift, though strands of it still clung to the water's surface. A long beam of sunlight stretched across the river like a golden walkway. The opposite bank was fully visible now, fields, a few low huts, the dark line of trees a little farther inland. The steps at the ghat were cool beneath my feet. When I touched the cracked stone, a small grain of sand broke away under my finger. The river lapped gently against the lower steps, and the sound of it blended with the faint swoosh of a boat's or somewhere upstream. As I knelt to begin the repair, a shadow moved near me. Arun had arrived with a small bowl of lime paste. Without speaking, he set it beside me and began clearing debris from the cracks in the steps. Our work fit together easily, as though the tasks themselves had arranged us. The morning sun rose higher, warming our backs. Fish broke the surface now and then, leaving small rings that drifted outward before disappearing. A pair of distant bells rang from the village temple across the river. The mist thinned until it vanished entirely. When the repair was complete, we washed our hands in the cool river water and stood for a moment, watching the current. Sunlight scattered across the surface in bright flecks, moving in gentle patterns. That is what he meant, Arun murmured. What? Brightness you do not reach for. It's just there. I lowered my gaze to the water again. The light was everywhere, but it wasn't something one could gather or touch. It moved because the river moved, and the river moved because the world itself breathed. We returned to the monastery quietly, carrying the tools back to their place. Later in the morning, Dev asked me to accompany him to the outer fields where the monastery grew a small patch of grain. The walk took us beyond the garden walls, along a narrow dirt path lined with tall dry grass. The sun had warmed the earth enough that the air smelled of dust and something floral carried on the breeze. The grain field was small compared to those in the village, but carefully tended. The stalks swayed gently in the wind, brushing together in a soft whispering. Dev walked slowly along the rows, touching the tops of the plants with the back of his hand. "They are almost ready," he said. "Not for harvest yet, but ready to turn toward the next stage." His words reminded me of the abbot's morning teaching, brightness that appears without reaching. We checked the irrigation channels, removed fallen twigs, and cleared a few patches where weeds had sprouted between the rows. Every movement felt tied to the land, to the cycle of sun and water. I felt no urgency, only an even rhythm that connected work with breath. When we finished, Dev stood for a moment facing the field. The wind moved through the grain, creating long waves that rippled outward. "See how it all leans," he said quietly. "Nothing stands apart from the wind. Not even us." We walked back to the monastery for the midday meal. The courtyard had warmed by then, its stones holding the heat of the rising sun. A few monks sat in the shade of the neem tree, one reading a palm leaf manuscript, two others simply resting. Shadows softened along the walls. Lunch was simple as always. The taste of the rice and lentils seemed more vivid today, as though the work in the fields had sharpened my senses. After eating, I washed my bowl and returned it to the shelf. The afternoon assigned to me was one of quiet study. In a shaded room off the main corridor, Ananta had prepared a few palm leaves for me to read, short passages about observing nature, plants, and the way sensations rise and fall in the body. The script was old but familiar. I traced each line slowly, sounding the syllables in my mind. Outside the open window, the breeze carried faint questions of sound, the rustle of leaves, the call of a bird, the distant, murmuring river. These sounds wove themselves into the reading, becoming part of its meaning without changing a single word. I read until the sunlight shifted to a deeper gold. Then Ananta took the manuscript from me, rolled it carefully, and said, "Enough for now. Knowledge settles best when it is not pressed too hard." I bowed and returned to the courtyard. Evening approached gently. The sky softened, becoming first pale, then peach-colored, then slowly deepening toward orange. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the stones. The air cooled slightly, carrying the promise of night. Before evening recitation, I walked alone toward the wall overlooking the western fields. The land glowed with a warm haze. The fireflies began their quiet dance again, their soft lights rising and falling among the tall grasses. I rested my arms on the wall and watched the sky shift. A thin crescent moon rose above the horizon, faint at first, then clearer. Its reflection trembled in the distant river, broken gently by the movement of water. When the bell sounded, I returned to the courtyard. The lamps had been lit. Their warm glow gathered in small pools around the space. We sat in our usual places, the stones cool beneath us. Tonight's chant felt slower, deeper. Our voices moved in long, even tones that filled the courtyard without ever rising above a calm volume. Something about the air felt unusually still, as if the world were leaning in to listen. When the chant ended, the abbot lifted his face to the sky for a long moment before speaking. The river teaches us to move. The sky teaches us to rest. Between the two, the mind learns to see clearly. He stood and left the courtyard, and we were free to prepare for sleep. I walked quietly toward my cell, but halfway there, I paused and stepped instead toward the ghat path. The night air was cool, brushing the skin lightly. The moonlight washed the ground in a pale glow. I walked down the path until I reached the top of the steps. The river lay before me, dark, shimmering, alive with quiet movement. Its surface reflected the moon like a long, trembling silver thread. I sat on one of the higher steps, letting my robe gather around me. The stone was cool. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and night flowers. The river spoke in its steady voice, neither loud nor soft, always the same, always different. For a long time, I simply watched. The moon drifted slowly upward. Stars appeared one by one. A fish broke the surface with a small splash, then disappeared again. Somewhere upstream, a boatman sang a low, melodic line that carried across the water like a thread of sound woven into silence. The brightness the abbot had mentioned that morning seemed clearer now, not the brightness of the sun, nor of understanding, but of acceptance. The gentle brightness of the river's surface under the moon, the kind that does not ask to be understood. When at last I stood and walked back to my cell, the monastery felt wrapped in a deep stillness. Lamps flickered behind a few windows. Footsteps echoed faintly, then faded. The sky above was clear, its stars sharp and steady. I lay down on my mat, my body sinking into the familiar shape of it. The room was cool, the stone beneath me solid and quiet. I closed my eyes. And in the darkness behind them, I saw again the river's quiet silver line, the moon trembling in its depths, the soft rise and fall of water. My breath found its pace. My thoughts loosened like grains of sand settling beneath water. Sleep came gently, like the river's slow turning, carrying me into a night without edges, deep and soft and whole.